you heard the story of how founding President Jomo Kenyatta betrayed and mercilessly assassinated the last general of the Mau Mau?
Harambe!
A dark secret of how Kenyatta betrayed and killed the heroes who fought for Kenya's liberation has remained hidden for over 50 years, and today we will uncover that secret in detail.
Vendera yetu eri igururi nyokuru arengi
Brava bakauga.
He said whatever his father.
This mind-blowing story reveals how the arrest of Jomo Kenyatta by the colonial government in 1952 actually saved his life from a plot to finish him that had been hatched by the real Mau Mau themselves after Kenyatta had betrayed their forest forces by bad-mouthing them in a meeting in Nyeri. This is the story of General Baimungi Marete, who was butchered by government assassins after he dared ask Mzee Jomo Kenyatta to name him the chief of all armed forces of Kenya in New Kenya's first government. You are also about to find out how Jomo Kenyatta lied to and cheated the entire Ameru tribe of Mount Kenya as his way of ascending to the presidency back then.
Kenyatta, what do you think of the activities of the Land Freedom Army?
Well, I don't know what they have been doing, and I don't know their activity.
Join me in this journey that will leave you asking plenty of questions about who exactly fought for the freedom and liberation of Kenya.
When do you want independence for Kenya?
Today.
We start this journey in January 1965. It's 4:30 a.m. early in the morning, and it's still pitch dark in the dense forests surrounding the Mount Kenya, and now we are in the Nyambene Hills in what was then known as the Meru district. Apart from crickets and the occasional hiss of a night creature, the forest is dead silent. However, there are people moving silently under the towering trees headed in one direction. Police officers armed with killer weapons, not one, not two, 150 of them, gliding through the bushes in unison with their guns pointed forward. By 1965, large parts of the land in these areas are still forests, held in trust by President Jomo Kenyatta as government property after the British colonialists had left Kenya under his care. And even as it sits here, Jomo Kenyatta already has big plans for the fertile land of Mount Kenya.
Mimi nafurahiwa sana kwa hapa tena na kusalimiana nanyi.
Finally, our battalion of 150 police officers moving through the forest cover approaches a spot in the forest where they stop and cock their weapons. This is the hideout of the last post-independence Mau Mau battalion, led by their Ameru General Field Marshal Baimungi Marete, formerly Simon Tomarete Ntoikandi, who had been Dedan Kimathi's number 2. General Baimungi Marete was the only senior leader of the Mau Mau Kenya Lands Defense Forces who had remained in the forest opposing the government even after Kenyatta had taken over from the British in 1963. After his meeting with Jomo Kenyatta ended in a bitter disagreement through events you are about to witness, Baimungi Marete then led his army of 2,000 Mau Mau soldiers to declare that the difference was the same between the governments of Kenyatta and that of the British imperial colonialists, and together they headed back into the forest to commence the second liberation.
Tufanye mambo yetu yote tukiwa waaminifu na tukiwa watu ambao si watu wa kupenda kunyang'anya.
But for now, let's go back to those 150 police officers crawling through the forest about to attack. As these police officers, many of whom were merely boys at that time, scared in their oversized boats, wait in the dark for a signal to launch the attack on Baimungi's camp, the Mau Mau down below were mostly sound asleep at this hour, not aware that Kenyatta's men had found their camp and all hell was breaking loose just minutes away. General Baimungi Marete himself, though, was wide awake. He was lying on his back by the embers of a dying fire, watching the dancing flames. His deep-set eyes had seen much war and violence since his days fighting for the British in the World War II. Blissfully oblivious to the dangers closing in on his camp, the Mau Mau general continues to reminisce of the bitterness he and his tribesmen felt when they returned from the war, only to find that the occupiers had claimed ownership to ancestral Ameru and Kikuyu land. And now the British are gone, but he still had to fight a new form of colonialist in his own land.
Jomo Kenyatta arrived at Jamhuri Park, Nairobi, to take the oath as president.
When he had been recruited to fight in the front lines in Italy during World War II, Baimungi had seen white men get killed in combat, and he learned not to fear them or think them superhuman. And he was in this trance of memory when all hell broke loose. 3 loud gunshot sounds tore through the silent air of the forest, scaring awake the birds and the men alike. Then came the sounds of men screaming and more gunshots. Within seconds, the entire camp had been overrun by armed police who were killing Baimungi's men indiscriminately. General Baimungi turned to grab his weapon, a 38 caliber revolver pistol, where he had stashed it as he rested by the fire. However, as the Mau Mau general extended his hand to get the weapon, the doorway to his tent was blown away and the barrel of a gun was immediately pointed to his head from outside. Baimungi knew immediately what had happened. He turned around and stood slowly, dropping the pistol, and raised his hand in surrender. The man holding the gun against Baimungi was a dark policeman with rough features and a mean look on his face. He meant business. Baimungi opened his mouth to say something to him in the dark, but before he could speak, another loud gunshot was heard from the entrance of the general's tent. His body dropped and blood splattered on the tent's walls. His shooter stood over him as the other Kaptura-wearing police joined him, and they watched as the last Mau Mau general choked in his own blood. Mission was accomplished. Once it was confirmed, the leader of the police ambush sent a message to the Kenyatta government minister who had ordered the attack on Baimungi Marete. The message had only 3 words in it: Baimungi is dead. As the morning sun rose over the Mount Kenya forest on that day in January 1965, the dead body of Field Marshal Baimungi Marete was paraded through the streets of Meru by Jomo Kenyatta's government soldiers, even though the people of Meru had been at the front of the Mau Mau War to liberate their land and people from the British as Kenyatta served jail time. On the following morning, the national Swahili newspaper Taifa Leo announced on its front page that Baimungi's death was a big win for Kenyatta's government against the last remaining Mau Mau terrorists. The execution of General Baimungi Marete on that day marked the end of a long movie-like saga that had started 2 years earlier when Baimungi had first agreed to come out of the forest and meet with the President Jomo Kenyatta himself. After Jomo Kenyatta had been picked as the new leader of independent Kenya, his first directive was to ask all Mau Mau fighters still hiding in the forest to come out and surrender their weapons because the war had finally been won.
November 16th, 1964, general amnesty for all Mau Mau.
He promised land and resettlement for all Mau Mau from the tribes of Meru, Kikuyu and Embu. A good number of those Mau Mau fighters listened to Kenyatta's request and came out of the bush after independence, led by another Meru general called Musa Mwariama. In the end, Jomo Kenyatta did not keep his promise to redistribute the fertile land amongst the freedom fighters, but instead he sold the land to rich Kenyans. Back then, any black Kenyan with wealth enough to buy land had likely made it working with the colonizing government. Most Mau Mau fighters and their families, whether Meru, Embu or Kikuyu, ended up as squatters or city tenants without any land to own.
Atakayecheza na Kenya yetu, atakayecheza na serikali yetu tukufu, sisi tutamponda ponda kama honga kabisa.
Despite Jomo Kenyatta's blatant betrayal of Mau Mau, General Baimungi Marete was also among those who had agreed to come out of the forest in 1963, 2 years before his dramatic early morning assassination. This here is the story of what happened on that day. On the day General Baimungi set out on his epic journey to meet with Kenyatta, he was accompanied by over 2,000 Mau Mau soldiers armed with guns, and the streets of Meru filled up with people who came out to see the revered Mau Mau general. It happened in that exact moment that there was another Meru man who was a very powerful figure in Jomo Kenyatta's new government. This was a man called Jackson Harvester Angaine, and together with Kenyatta, he had schemed an elaborate plot to betray Baimungi once he had accepted to abandon his forest hideout. For his role in this betrayal, Jomo Kenyatta later rewarded Jackson Angaine by making him Minister for Lands.
Asanteni sana. Sasa mawaziri wataimba nyimbo. Come on.
When General Baimungi Marete and his 2,000 Mau Mau soldiers arrived, expecting to meet President Kenyatta at the Meru Stadium in Meru, Mzee didn't show up, but instead he opted to send in his place Minister Angaine and his cabinet colleague Mbiyo Koinange. Baimungi handed over many of the weapons his men held to the government in that meeting at Meru. Feeling disrespected, Baimungi and his 2,000 soldiers set camp and waited for 3 days at the stadium as their meeting with the president was being arranged and negotiated. On the third day, Lance Minister Angaine would eventually accompany General Baimungi and his forces to Mzee Kenyatta's home in Gatondo, Embu. In the beginning, Jomo Kenyatta received the Mau Mau general and his soldiers with warmth and open arms, and he even gifted Baimungi a new Land Rover. On the day the two men met, Jomo Kenyatta proclaimed before all that were present to give Baimungi 3 major farmlands in Mount Kenya, formerly occupied by colonialists, for him and his men to settle in. These 3 farms were at least 1,000 acres each. Among the 3 plantations to be divided amongst the 2,000 Mau Mau soldiers was one large farm known as Monroe Farm, which could generate millions every season from its produce and was previously owned by a white man of the same name. It's after Mzee Jomo Kenyatta's superfluous promise of land that General Baimungi, having listened keenly to Mzee, raised his voice and proclaimed that he had one final request to make. Once he had Kenyatta's attention, Baimungi pulled him aside and in confidence told Mzee Kenyatta point blank to make him the commander of Kenya's armed forces, since they now had the freedom they fought for and his men were battle-hardened and ready for national defense. In spite of General Baimungi Marete's expertise in forest combat and military leadership amongst the Mau Mau, Jomo Kenyatta denied his request. Kenyatta's blunt refusal injured Baimungi's pride, having considered himself a respected hero by those outside the forest after the government of Kenya had turned all black, especially since he had been the de facto Mau Mau leader following the capture of Dedan Kimathi about 7 years prior to this Gatondo meeting.
Most Kikuyu were just as certain Kenyatta, their leader, ran Mau Mau, but the men who did disagree.
How much did Kenyatta know about the organization of Mau Mau?
I think he knew nothing.
It's widely believed that Kenyatta feared to give Baimungi military leadership and end up being overthrown by these Mau Mau fighters in the future. Other accounts and opinions believe that Jomo Kenyatta suffered an imposter syndrome, feeling that men like Baimungi Marete were the true liberation heroes of Kenya, and that if he let them too close to power, the people of Kenya would celebrate the Mau Mau more and elevate them above Kenyatta and his fellow Western educated leaders.
That the oil producing countries intend to raise price yet again in January.
As Baimungi Marete returned to Meru from meeting Jomo Kenyatta in Gatondo, he was not very happy about what Mzee had offered him, but what he did not know was that an even bigger betrayal was awaiting him where he was going. It had been agreed between Kenyatta and General Baimungi that Jackson Harvester Angaine would oversee the transfer of those 3,000-acre farms to the general and his men in the army of Mau Mau. Baimungi waited in Meru for weeks and months, but the promised land was never delivered by Angaine. Finally, as his men grew more restless, he decided to go to see Jomo Kenyatta again and remind him about the promise. However, Baimungi's procession of 2,000 Mau Mau did not get far this time round, because the politician Jackson Angaine ironically sent police to block their path. Regardless of Mzee Kenyatta's solemn promise, he had decided to give none of the land to these Mau Mau fighters or their leader. After Jomo Kenyatta backslid on his pledge, Baimungi took swift action. He gathered all his men and instructed them to gather all the weapons they had not handed over to the government in Meru Stadium. On the next day, Baimungi led his men back into the forest and they formally declared war on Mzee Jomo Kenyatta's government. From inside the bush, Baimungi fought Jomo Kenyatta's government for 2 years straight, insisting that Kenyatta's administration had betrayed Mau Mau heroes and their families. On his side, Mzee Jomo Kenyatta tightened his grip on power and leadership of Kenya's military and civilian strongholds.
Pango ya KANU ndio hiyo. Kila mmoja wa hao 611 atakuwa akizungumza mambo ambayo yamewekwa tayari.
Kenyatta lived his early years as Kenyan leader in constant fear of the men who remained in the forest, whom he knew to be fearless soldiers with hunger for land and power. Although not as brave and combat-ready as Dedan Kimathi and Baimungi were, Kenyatta used his political cunning and education to not just seize the independence moment, but also write the history of Mau Mau as if he was one of them.
My dear countrymen, last night there was an incident at Lanik camp.
For example, when he first gets arrested by colonial officers in October 20th, 1952, Kenyatta was already in danger of being attacked by factions of radical Mau Mau freedom fighters who had been attacking and killing collaborators, and they had heard that he was denouncing them as terrorists in meetings across Mount Kenya. It reported that at the time of his arrest, Kenyatta had been hiding in his Gatondo house, fearing because the Mau Mau had slaughtered a senior colonial chief just weeks earlier, a killing that had scared the colonial authorities into declaring a state of emergency, resting every KAU leader in big panic. Meaning to protect himself politically, Jomo Kenyatta had maintained an anti-Mau Mau stance publicly throughout his incarceration in the 1950s, even though many of his fellow Kapenguria detainees had remained loyal and respectful to the Mau Mau. Also, on the day he was released from prison in Kapenguria in 1961, Kenyatta was quoted as having denounced Mau Mau fighters and calling them terrorists, to the amusement of the colonial farmers who would later hand over the government to him when it was their time to return to London. In later editions of history books, Jomo Kenyatta would assign himself and his wife Ngina prominent roles in the struggle for the liberation of the people and land of Kenya, especially people of Meru, Kikuyu and Embu. After the death of Field Marshal Baimungi Marete, the last embers of the Mau Mau fire had been extinguished forever.